So first, the caveats. Attempting to do this in an hour or so borders on the absurd. Secondly, I am not a historian or a sociologist or a political scientist or an anthropologist, any of whom might be able to do this better than I. But what does qualify me to give you this talk is a couple things, I guess. I'm a middle-aged gay man who came out right after college in the early 70s, long before you were all born, in Boston. And I'm trained in public health, and I worked for about 15 years in HIV and AIDS before I began teaching at NCCU about 13 years ago. So I've been around since the beginning of the epidemic, and my partner is Royce Harden, who was on your HIV positive panel in February. And he's been HIV positive for 22 years. We've been together 21 years. So he was positive before we got together. And he's still around and I'm still around. So that's something in and of itself. So I've witnessed firsthand, both professionally and personally, the impact of AIDS on gay men and their friends and their loved ones. So I'm going to talk to you today about gay male life. I'm not going to take on the lesbian, bisexual, or transgender experience. And I can speak for myself and some friends, and that's about it. I don't see myself as a spokesperson for gay America. Besides, there isn't one gay community in America, but many. There are gay urban professionals and rural gays and leathermen and radical fairies and drag queens and gay activists and gay fathers and gay teachers. And there are lots of gay men who belong to more than one of these communities and lots of gay men who don't associate with any particular gay subpopulation. And there are also lots of men who have sex with other men who don't see themselves or don't identify as gay. So even within my gay identified friends, there are lots of differences. Here are a couple of those. I've been out at every job I've had since 1975. I've chosen jobs where I could be out. My partner Royce, though, was not out on his job for good reason. He was an agricultural extension agent, and he worked with farmers here in North Carolina. It's doubtful that he would have been accepted or effective in his work if his sexual orientation were known. Most of our gay male friends are not parents, but I have a 25-year-old daughter whom I co-parented from birth with two lesbian friends of mine. And my partner was married for 10 years before he came out in his 30s, and he has two children from that marriage who spent summers with us while they were growing up. And right now is a little example of hard economic times. Our 25-year-old daughter and 26-year-old daughter are living with us again. There you have it. 25-year-old daughter because she's in grad school here at UNC. Any of you in the School of Social Work? No? Okay. She's there. All right. So, many of the gay men that I admired most in my life have died of AIDS. Many of the bravest, smartest, most life-affirming men that I know. That I am still here has little to do with self-restraint or intelligence, and lots to do with a certain sexual timidity on my part, and dumb luck, and grace. Not mine, mind you, but grace as in there, but by the grace of God go any of us. So, I'll come back to these guys a little later on. Now for the credits. Much of what I'm going to be saying to you today is drawn from three books. One by historian Martin Duberman, About Time, Exploring the Gay Past. Another by John D'Amelio, used to teach at UNC Greensboro. His book is Making Trouble, Essays on Gay History, Politics, and the University. And then a book by a journalist named John Manuel Andreotti called Victory Deferred, How AIDS Changed Gay Life in America. Anything really insightful that I say today is theirs. Okay, so first I have to distinguish between homosexual behavior, which is universal, and homosexual identity, which is historically specific. That is, people have been engaging in homosexual behavior for thousands of years, but it's only been in the past 100 years or so that people have developed a personal identity based on their sexual orientation. So how did this happen? Well, John D'Amelio notes that the rise of capitalism had a lot to do with it. The development of cities where single people could work and live separate from their biological families, and where they could carve out a social, emotional, and sexual life for themselves that was not defined by their role in their biological family or a close-knit rural community. But capitalism and city life aren't the whole story. Both D'Amelio and Duberman discuss the importance of changes in our understanding of and morality around sex. The past 150 years has seen a growing appreciation and acceptance of non-procreative sex. Initially just within the confines of marriage, of course, but by the 1960s, sex had come to be valued as a form of self-expression, fueling both the women's and the gay liberation movements. D'Amelio also identifies World War II as a powerful force shaping the development of a gay identity. The war was a time when millions of young American men and women were plucked from their homes and deposited in a variety of sex-segregated, non-familial environments, the military and defense factories, where it was possible to explore same-sex love and affection. Some never went home again, or went home again with a new sense of who they were. Finally, the development of a gay urban subculture enabled some kind of collective resistance to the harassment and discrimination that gay men and lesbians often experience at the hands of police, government officials, etc. So initially, this resistance was very limited, very tame. A tiny number of gay men and lesbians banded together in a few organizations to support one another and to quietly seek reforms that would diminish the oppression of homosexuals. They wanted acceptance, and so they publicly presented themselves as if they were like everyone else in America, except for this one small way. At this point, I think it makes some sense to talk a little bit about how a homosexual identity develops at the individual level, and a couple of matters related to that. So you're not born into a homosexual identity as you are into a racial identity or a gender identity. And you're not even socialized into that identity at an early age as you are with a religious identity. A homosexual identity has to be discovered and accepted, usually in the face of considerable bad press from your family, your friends, your church, society as a whole. So if a homosexual identity has to be discovered and accepted, that raises the issue of choice. And I would maintain that you do have a choice. But you don't get to choose which gender you're attracted to physically and emotionally. I don't think any of you would maintain that you chose to be attracted to the people you're attracted to. You just are. Okay? Instead, what you get to choose is to accept that orientation or to hide it. And in the many cultures that have viewed homosexual behavior as a sin, homosexuality itself is usually considered a chosen path. But if it's not chosen, there is still the question of what causes it, the nature versus nurture issue. Is homosexuality biological in its origin, or is it the result of one's environment and early experience. So I think the jury is still out on this one, though there is increasing evidence of a biological component to sexual orientation. First, scientists have discovered structural differences in the parts of the brain governing sexual expression, differences between homosexuals, both male and female, and their heterosexual counterparts. Secondly, it's fairly well established that homosexuality is widespread throughout the animal kingdom. My favorite story here is a report from a few years ago. I don't know whether you remember this, but two gay male penguins, completely devoted to one another, adopted a baby penguin and raised it as their own. Pretty cutting edge on their part, I think. So my initial take on the nature versus nurture issue was, who cares? But actually the question, who cares, is an important one. Because the answer is usually the people who care are those who are trying to prove that homosexuality is environmental, so that they can then figure out how to undo those environmental forces and turn people like me straight. Please. So throughout the 1950s and 60s, New York City police periodically raided gay bars, harassing and arresting their patrons. But in June 1969, they struck the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, a hangout for many minority drag queens, and this time, the queens struck back. As D'Amelio states, Stonewall has assumed mythic proportions within the gay community. It is viewed as the beginning of the gay revolution, in part because it so elegantly contradicts the stereotype of meek, limp-wristed fairies and supplants it with a fabulous image of enraged drag queens rioting in the streets and taking on helmeted New York City police. And on a personal note, I have a good friend who was there for Stonewall, and he's still alive and kicking, and living with HIV, but he's pretty proud of the fact that he was there when all that happened. Okay. So the Stonewall riot birthed something called the Gay Liberation Front, which only lived a short while, but in that time helped to fashion a new language and style of homosexuality that was based on pride and affirmation. The style was often flamboyant and outrageous, meant to shock and confront traditional gender roles. This Gay Liberation Front also transformed the meaning of coming out, from the personal to the political. So coming out became both a goal of the movement to help people liberate themselves, and it was also a strategy of the movement to swell its ranks. Out of the closets and into the streets, I am out, therefore I am. There was a migration of gays to the now liberated zones where most of this activity was happening. The urban enclaves of San Francisco, Boston, and New York led to a new social phenomenon, visibly gay residential areas. And this is the Castro in San Francisco. And from what I understand, things change. So gay people moved into the Castro back in the 60s and the 70s, sort of became the gay center of life in California. And now gay people are moving out of the Castro, and it's become a sort of a posh, straight enclave in San Francisco. So times change. Harvey Milk, dubbed the mayor of Castro Street after he was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. And he sort of represents the downside of this new visibility. It was easier to identify us, to threaten us, commit violence against us, and Harvey Milk was assassinated less than, I think, a year and a half after being elected to the Board of Supervisors. Also on a personal note, the only time that I've ever been attacked for being a gay man was a summer that I spent in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is considered a gay mecca, big gay resort. But clearly easily identifiable in a situation like that, and a relatively easy target. So the Gay Liberation Front occurred within the context of a broad crisis of authority in the United States in the 1970s. Stonewall could spawn a national grassroots gay liberation movement because of other radical movements that preceded it and accompanied it. The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, women's liberation, and the anti-war movement, because this was the height of our involvement in Vietnam. For a variety of reasons, the Gay Liberation Front didn't last very long. By the mid-70s, most gay male activism had returned to the reformist mode of the 1950s. It had become, again, a quest for rights based on a need to belong more than a need to rebel. But there were some significant differences from pre-Stonewall days. There was a lot more pride. There was this perceived imperative to come out for a lot of us, and a rejection of society's traditional cultural views of homosexuality. So that was the 70s. And then along came AIDS. With the first cases reported among previously healthy young gay men in the summer of 1981. That was my first summer here in North Carolina when I was a master's student at the School of Public Health. So the numbers grew steadily and dramatically, but initially denial characterized the response of many men involved in the gay subculture. It's just a plot to keep us from having sex, was one response. Early on, gay leaders who called for changes in sexual behavior were reviled by some members of the gay community. And gay bathhouses and some of their patrons and some gay media, gay newspapers that were dependent on bathhouse ads for their revenue refused, at least publicly, to take AIDS seriously, which was interesting. I mean, there were ongoing, in the past in this course, they showed the video and the band played on. Did they do that this year? No? Okay. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth watching in terms of a history of the AIDS epidemic in the early days, when there were these huge debates within the gay community about how seriously we should be taking all of this. And it really split the gay community for a while. Certainly, though, there were many gay men who were taking notice. Attendance at bathhouses in San Francisco declined by 65% in 1983. 6 of 20 bathhouses closed before public health officials shut all of them down for a while, as they did in Los Angeles and New York City. For those gay men who became active in AIDS work, AIDS bridged the gap between the gay subculture in which they lived and the gay political movement of which they were going to become an important part. Because the government did precious little initially, AIDS led to the reinvigoration of grassroots local activism. The government was not responding, so gay men took it upon themselves to try and piece together some kind of viable response to what was going on. Lots more on that in a moment. The AIDS movement within gay communities spread to parts of the country that hadn't been touched by the gay movement of the 1970s. So you found organizations in places like, Des Moines, Iowa, and Montana, where there was no visible gay community organizations prior to the onset of AIDS. So why was all of this necessary, and how did it come about? President Ronald Reagan, president from 1980 to 81 to 1989, never once uttered the word AIDS in any speech that he gave until May 1989, 8 years after the first cases of AIDS were reported and 6 years into a major epidemic. This guy was the president of the United States and never once mentioned AIDS. And despite some heroic efforts by individuals at the Centers for Disease Control, the Reagan administration's response to the epidemic largely echoed Reagan's silence itself. Perhaps shaped by the views of right-wing groups like the Moral Majority, whose leader, Jerry Falwell, asked, "Why should the taxpayers have to spend money to cure diseases that don't have to start in the first place? Let's help the drug users who want to be helped and the Haitian people. But let the homosexual community do its own research. Why should the American taxpayer have to bail out these perverted people?" Pretty clear? So the Reagan administration's reluctance to fund AIDS efforts led to a major reliance on voluntary contributions raised largely by gay men and the AIDS service organizations that they founded, with critical assistance from lesbian and heterosexual allies. So I'm going to digress for a moment and give you some more personal history. So I was at the School of Public Health getting my master's from 1980 to 1982, and then I decided to stay on and work on a doctorate in health behavior and health education. And in that fall of 1982, the year I started the doctoral program, I had a friend in Durham named Carl Whitman, and later on we became housemates. Carl had been at the forefront of the Gay Liberation Front. In fact, he wrote the Gay Manifesto, which sort of set out the aims of the movement. That fall, in 1982, Carl pulled together two lesbian friends and me to discuss the formation of a group to improve the quality of health care for gay men and lesbians in North Carolina. And we call this organization the Lesbian and Gay Health Project, or LGHP. Within a year of our founding, most of our efforts were focused on AIDS, and we morphed into the first AIDS service organization in North Carolina. We didn't intend to do that initially. We were going to address the broad array of health issues affecting gay men and lesbians, and the problem that many of us felt that we weren't getting quality care. But we were hijacked by the AIDS epidemic. I mean, we had to respond. So we did community-based education, we staffed a hotline, and we provided some basic support services to people living with and usually dying from this disease. And we did this because nobody else was doing it. Certainly no state or local health department. And we did it with virtually no money. There was no government or foundation funding at that point. In fact, I wanted to attend the second or third National AIDS Conference, which was accompanied by the National Lesbian Gay Health Conference in Denver in 1983. We had no money, so I literally went door to door to businesses in Chapel Hill that I heard were sort of gay-friendly and asked for donations. And they sent me to Denver. All right. So, besides education and service organizations like the LGHP, government non-responsiveness led to the formation of groups like ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. ACT UP adopted tactics of direct action and civil disobedience that hadn't been seen since the early days of the Gay Liberation Front. Gay men scattered their lovers' ashes on the White House lawn, shouting, "Shame, shame, shame in Reagan's direction. ACT UP also spawned some really great graphics. This is one, and this is probably the most famous AIDS graphic of all. Ignorance equals fear, silence equals death, fight AIDS, ACT UP. Designed by a graphic artist named Keith Haring, who died of AIDS a few years after he designed this. Okay, so what I want to do now is look briefly and separately at what happened in three different arenas during this period. I want to look at AIDS prevention, I want to look at AIDS treatment research, and then at AIDS care. So in terms of prevention, gay men and gay established AIDS organizations developed their own safer sex guidelines and programs because the government either wouldn't or couldn't. One example of this is the Helms Amendment, as in Jesse Helms. Those of you who are native North Carolinians, I assume would remember him. He hasn't been dead that long. The Helms Amendment to the Labor, Health, and Human Services Education Appropriations Bill of 1987, which came along while I was working for the AIDS Control Branch, and which was pretty discouraging at the time, prohibited the use of federal money, and we had just gotten some federal money to mount some AIDS education and prevention campaigns. But it prohibited the use of federal money for any AIDS educational materials that, quote, promote or encourage either directly or indirectly homosexual activities, unquote. It passed the US Senate 99-0. And what that meant was that we had to be exceedingly careful in any materials that we developed that targeted gay men. Because if we were telling gay men how to have safer sex, we were indirectly encouraging gay men to have sex. Or so that was the interpretation of a whole lot of politicians in North Carolina, including a lot of the people that I worked with, because this was the Martin administration, a conservative Republican administration that I served under for the 4.5 years that I worked at the AIDS Control Branch. So many politicians and public health people viewed gay men as so successful at educating their own people and raising their own money that government support and funding was considered unnecessary. For instance, in California in the early 90s, gay men accounted for 88% of all people with AIDS in that state. 88% of all people in California with AIDS were gay men. Prevention efforts targeting gay men received 5% of the state's prevention dollars. 88% of the cases, 5% of the dollars. So that is why the gay community raised a whole lot of money itself to develop materials. But it was sort of this reinforcing, self-fulfilling prophecy. The more successful the gay community was at raising monies to do its own prevention work, the more likely it was that politicians would say, oh, they don't need our help. They've got it together. So it was kind of a catch-22. Okay, so this is one of the posters that was developed by San Francisco AIDS Project, one of the leading AIDS service organizations in the country at that time. Not explicit, but the kind of thing that might not have been developed by a government agency. Certainly, the North Carolina AIDS Control Branch would never have gotten away with a poster that looked like this. All right, next up, treatment research. The formation of ACT UP was inspired by the slow approval process and the high pricing of AZT. AZT was the very first anti-HIV drug developed. Again, through direct actions that included interrupting trading on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and members of ACT UP chaining themselves to the doors of pharmaceutical offices. ACT UP played an important role in the revision of the Food and Drug Administration's drug approval process, and then in convincing drug manufacturers to lower the prices of various AIDS medications. ACT UP returned gay activists to the radical social and political analysis of American institutions that had characterized the early gay liberation movement. And it became a model of direct action for people living with other life-threatening diseases, most notably breast cancer. The organizations that are at sort of the forefront of breast cancer activism today learned many of their tactics from ACT UP. The organizations called Project Inform of San Francisco and the AIDS Treatment News Group out of New York focused on disseminating the latest information on treatments so that people with HIV and AIDS did not have to completely rely on a conservative and sometimes ill-informed medical establishment for current news on AIDS research. Patients did their own research, and they came to their doctor with a whole lot of information about what was going on with them and what they felt they needed to do. Lastly, the Community Research Initiative of New York City and the County Communities Consortium of San Francisco actually conducted its own research. These two groups tested a drug called aerosolized pentamidine as a preventive therapy for pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, which was the illness, the AIDS-related illness that was killing more people than any other at that time. And these trials were very successful. They proved that aerosolized pentamidine worked, and aerosolized pentamidine became the first drug that was ever approved by the Food and Drug Administration on the basis of research that was done by a community group, as opposed to scientists at NIH or university-based researchers. It was impressive stuff. It really was. Okay, so turning to care for people living with HIV and AIDS. So like the Lesbian and Gay Health Project, community-based AIDS service organizations all over the US were providing direct care and support services to persons with AIDS. They felt they had to create a parallel system of health care and social services for gay men because they couldn't depend on mainstream organizations for those services. Often they were learning by doing. That was certainly true for us at LGHP. We really did not know how to begin providing services until a young man named Michael from Marion, North Carolina, in the foothills of the North Carolina mountains, came home to North Carolina from San Francisco to die. Though his family was in Marion, he was getting most of his care at the VA in Durham because he was a vet, and certainly there was no adequate care for people with AIDS in Western North Carolina at that time. So he moved to Durham. Well, for a while, he essentially commuted from Marion to Durham for his care. But as he got sicker, he moved to Durham, and he became our first client. And it was Michael who showed us what to do. As he got sicker and sicker, he taught us what people with AIDS were up against, what they needed, and what we could do to support them. And this was anything from buying groceries for him, to cutting his hair, to advocating for him when he was in the hospital, because the people from the kitchen at the VA wouldn't bring in his food. They left it outside his door, and we would bring it in to him. When the custodial staff came in to empty his trash, they wore moon suits. They were completely covered from head to toe. And there was a lot of ignorance back then and a huge amount of fear. And we were all scared because nobody really knew exactly what was going on here. But there was also a determination to try and make sure that these guys that we were working with got some semblance of humane care. So, and we learned from our clients. As Andreotti writes, AIDS service organizations were cobbled together by people with far more passion than managerial acumen. And for this reason, many AIDS service organizations eventually floundered, LGHP among them. But others did survive, and they became models for better health care delivery for all persons with chronic life-threatening diseases, models that are community-based and volunteer-driven, that provide low-cost services to improve the quality of people's lives and help them stay out of the hospital as much as possible. So this is the case with a couple of agencies that LGHP helped to get off the ground. Even as LGHP went kaput, there were a couple of agencies that we had helped to start in other parts of the state. Triad Health Project in Greensboro, and the Alliance of AIDS Services in Raleigh, that are still going strong today. So to accomplish all of this, gay men had to transcend deep fears about this disease and doubts about their own ability to do this work before we could band together to care for one another as an army of lovers in the fight against AIDS. And very often, the gay men who were doing this work were wounded healers. They were caregivers, and they were at risk, bereaved, or infected themselves. As they cared for the sick and dying, they knowingly watched their own future unfold in someone else's illness. Here in Durham, a guy named Doug became Michael's primary caregiver. Spent enormous amounts of time with Michael. Michael called Doug his angel. And Doug was HIV positive himself, as was his lover, Glenn. So Doug would soon be providing the same care to Glenn that he provided Michael, no doubt wondering in both cases when it would be his turn. So these guys, this is true for all of the guys listed here. They were not just friends of mine, they were also leaders in this struggle. They were activists and they were caregivers. Scott, I mentioned Carl, the guy who got us together to found LGHP in 1982. He died of AIDS in 1986, and more of that in a little bit. Scott worked with me at the AIDS Care Branch in the State Health Department and died while he was still working with us in 1988. Nat established the very first AIDS care residence in Durham. Ron Sable was a conference buddy of mine. I met at one of those AIDS conferences, and he was a physician who treated people with AIDS in Chicago's prison system. Carell was a community AIDS educator in Durham, on and on. So I want to note three things about these guys and many others who were living with AIDS back then. First, many of them bravely stepped forward and identified themselves as living with this highly stigmatizing disease. This is Bobby Campbell, a nurse from San Francisco, a guy with a wicked sense of humor, a self-appointed AIDS poster boy, who is seen here marching in the 1983 San Francisco Gay Pride Parade a little more than a year before he died. He was on the cover of Newsweek magazine that year. Many of these guys noted the similarity of coming out as a person with AIDS and coming out as a gay man, with similar risks of rejection, discrimination, hostility. The second thing I want to note is that gay men as a group shun the term AIDS victim because it connotes helplessness and defeat. And even if they were ultimately going to lose the battle, they were fighters, they were not victims. Many rejected the term AIDS patient as well. They were only patients some of the time, and they did not want to be defined by their illness. Nor did they buy into the dependence and the passivity that is associated with the patient role. So they came up with a new term, and thus was born the acronym PWA, or Person with AIDS, or PLWA, Person Living with AIDS. The third thing I want to note about these guys is that they birthed the true doctor-patient relationship through their insistence that their physicians respect their knowledge and opinions and include them in treatment decisions. And this too has become a model for persons with other life-threatening diseases. So some comments on the impacts of the epidemic. Early AIDS organizations in large cities often ignored gay people of color who had or were at risk for HIV. Furthermore, some of the hardest hit black communities denied or ignored AIDS. So black men who had sex with other men were in this double bind, ignored by the white gay community, ignored and denied by the black community. Ultimately, however, there were two silver linings to this cloud. First, many gay-focused AIDS organizations eventually became more inclusive of racial and ethnic minorities than other gay organizations had been prior to the epidemic. And secondly, within racial and ethnic communities, AIDS fostered a dialogue on homophobia and gay oppression that had never happened prior to AIDS. The involvement of lesbians in AIDS work also deserves notice. Their contributions were enormous. They stepped into positions of authority within AIDS organizations, often filling a void that was left by gay men as they died off. As I mentioned, in the 80s and early 90s, I regularly attended national conferences on AIDS and LGBT health issues, and it really was eerie and disturbing. Each year, guys who had led the previous conference failed to return, and more the leadership roles were assumed by women. We lost an entire generation of gay male leaders in those years. At LGHP, women were a critical part of the support teams for people living with AIDS, and a lesbian activist named Jill Duvall actually became the director of LGHP for several years. Finally, let me note one other byproduct of AIDS, and through AIDS, the gay movement gained access to money, skills, and recruits that it had never had before. And not just for AIDS work, but for the broader agenda of gay politics. So strangely, AIDS brought a stability and a permanence to many fragile organizations within gay communities. So, AIDS was a death sentence in those early years. On average, people lived about 2 years after diagnosis, sometimes much less. My friend Scott Husted, that I worked with at the AIDS Control Branch, died 4 months after he was diagnosed. And I think it's safe to say that no single group of Americans in modern times has lost as many people to epidemic illness as gay men in America lost to AIDS during that period. And in fact, at some point, the gay subculture just became death-saturated. Gay newspapers were filled with obituaries of men under the age of 40. I mean, pages. If you looked at the Washington Blade, the gay newspaper in D.C., just pages after pages after pages of gay men under the age of 40 who had died in the last 2 weeks. Some gay men lost most of their friends, attending funerals week after week after week. Survivor guilt was a very common phenomenon, with gay men wondering why they were still alive when so many of their friends were gone. And also there was this sense of aging before our time that permeated a lot of gay communities. I remember watching Scott, who was 28 at the time that he died, get out of a car a few months before he died. And I remember thinking to myself, that is exactly how my 84-year-old grandfather moves. And it was sobering. In the eyes of many people who were not gay, homosexuality itself became associated with death. Gay equals AIDS equals dead. Many ignored or downplayed the losses of the gay community, in part because of homophobia, no doubt, but also because of their own fear of death and their need to distance themselves from the deaths of so many young people, lest they be forced to deal with their own mortality. On the other hand, a striking example of an entirely different response to the epidemic was a woman named Franny Peabody, as described in an essay called A Woman of a Certain Age by a gay writer named John Preston. So Franny Peabody's grandson had died of AIDS. And as a result of that experience, this 90-year-old, very wealthy, blue blood pillar of Portland, Maine society became an AIDS activist, and she personally cared for many gay men with AIDS. And she told Preston, quote, "That's the one thing you young men have given me. You've shown me that one can die with dignity and with courage. I was so petrified of death. It was so frightening to me. But now I understand that death comes, that one can greet it with a sense of propriety. I've sat with so many men and watched life leave them. So many, and they were all so brave. You will be too. You are already." Now, the irony of this is that Preston had not told Franny that he had AIDS himself, and he died of AIDS several years after this interview and this article that he wrote. So back here in Durham, in 1986, my friend Carl Whitman, who is now my housemate, the guy who wrote the Gay Manifesto and pulled us all together to birth LGHP, was diagnosed with AIDS in the fall of '85. Was admitted to UNC Hospital, put on AZT for pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, had a terrible allergic reaction to it, and decided that was it. He was done. And the doctors wanted him to try something else or try AZT again after waiting a little bit, and Carl said no. He was going home, and he knew that meant he was going home to die. And he spent, he and his partner, his lover Alan, spent half a day arguing with doctors at UNC Hospital, trying to convince them that he had the right to make that decision and that that was a reasonable decision to make. And they never agreed with him publicly, but they had to let him go. And later on, a nurse who was present during much of that told us that afterwards the doctors all agreed that he had done the right thing. But none of them were willing to admit that at the time. I guess, as they just didn't feel like they could. It was giving up, too publicly giving up or something like that. So anyway, he came home to get ready to die. And he, at a certain point, made a very conscious decision that he was going to take his own life at 43 because he did not want to endure the painful last week or two of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. So he announced this to us, and we, his friends, gathered around him and Alan, offering practical and emotional support as best we could, everything from preparing meals to arranging for Carl's cremation. And it was an amazing What happened there? Oh, okay. It's up there. All right. So all of that was an amazing experience. That was, it was filled with fear for me, and it was also filled with sadness. But there was also this sense of grace and community that came with gathering around Carl and Alan at this time. For many gay men, AIDS helped to foster a sense of community that was not there prior to the epidemic, a sense of kinship, a sense that we are, to some extent, our brother's keepers. For others, however, AIDS served as an outlet for internalized homophobia. It reacted feelings of self-doubt and self-hatred. What have I done wrong to be gay, to have gotten this disease, to be dying of AIDS? So, the mourner's Kaddish is a Jewish prayer for the dead that tells us to remember the dead in order that they may live in our hearts, minds, and spirits, in us as individuals and in us as a community. And this is the AIDS quilt, a picture taken the last time it was shown in its entirety on the mall in D.C., now too large to display in its entirety anywhere. Certainly a way of remembering the dead. A friend of mine named Pat wrote an article about coping with the loss of her 21-year-old son. She implied that if the Kaddish is a vehicle by which the dead are remembered and continue to live, then we can be a Kaddish ourselves. And so we can become the Kaddish for our friends and family who have died of AIDS. It is the responsibility of the Kaddish to speak of the dead, to keep their memory alive, to not forget, and to not let others forget. So we remember the dead in order that they may live. But this is no easy thing because, as Pat said, to be the Kaddish is to be willing to suffer the grief of remembering. So, fast forward to today. The progress in treatment over the past 15 years has been truly remarkable. People on their deathbeds were brought back to life with the introduction of the drug combinations known as HAART, or highly active antiretroviral therapy, in the mid-90s. And this included Doug, Michael's angel. Doug buried Michael one year and his partner Glenn the next year. And in the early 90s, Doug experienced a series of opportunistic infections that landed him in the hospital numerous times and left him completely emaciated, exhausted, and near death. It was 1996. Along came HAART. Doug got on it, and 15 years later, Doug is very much alive, a horticulturalist here in Durham in his late 50s, widely respected throughout the Southeast for his ability to design and grow amazing gardens. So it's a miracle. It is truly a miracle for these guys who got on HAART back in the mid-90s. And yet, this progress has had one downside. It has led to some dangerous complacency about risk-taking. It has reduced some people's commitment to safer sex. It has fostered the belief that if I get infected, I'll just take the meds and I'll be fine, like Magic Johnson. It ain't that easy. Living with HIV, even in 2012, is no cakewalk. Even if the meds are working, your HIV viral load is undetectable and your CD4 count is high. People who have been living with this disease for 15 years or more are developing diseases in their 40s and 50s that people don't usually experience till they're in their late 60s, 70s, 80s. And why? Sometimes because of the meds that they've been on so long, the horrible side effects that those meds can have. Sometimes because HIV has continued to progress in places in their bodies that the meds can't reach, or can't reach very well. And lots of times because we don't know, and the doctors don't know. And they will tell you that up front. They do not know what is going on that is leading to these guys developing all of these diseases at 45, 50 that you would expect to see in somebody 75. So my partner Royce deals with chronic fatigue, high cholesterol, neurological problems, and degenerative joint disease. So there are two bottom lines here. HIV is no longer a death sentence, and you do not want it. And yet, many gay men continue to engage in unsafe sex in the year 2010. Studies show that a growing number admit to unprotected anal intercourse in the previous 6 months. Why is this happening? Here are 4 of many reasons. One is the false belief that HIV is no big deal these days. 2, that sense of invulnerability that most, if not all, young people have, and I imagine that many of you have it. It's not going to happen to me. That's a disease that old gay white guys get. I don't have to worry about it. 3, the loss of judgment that can come in the heat of the moment, especially under the influence of alcohol and other drugs. I won't ask for a show of hands, but my guess is that there are a few of you out there who have experienced a loss of judgment from time to time, under or not under the influence. 4, homophobia. Now, why do I say homophobia is one reason why an increasing number of young gay men are engaging in unprotected sex? Well, I'm sure that you're all aware of the recent rash of suicides among young gay men that homophobic bullying has led to. Well, I believe that homophobia can also lead to a more gradual form of self-destruction. You hear homophobic remarks often enough, and your self-esteem can plummet to the point that you don't really feel your life is worth protecting all that much. And it can be a pretty short trip from feeling that way to acting that way through unprotected sex, through drug abuse, and other high-risk activities. So in this climate, fighting homophobia becomes an important way of fighting AIDS. In the past few years, studies by the Centers for Disease Control have found that 30% of young gay black men ages 23 to 29 in large U.S. cities are testing positive for HIV. That's 4 times the rate of young white gay men. Those are rates that rival HIV rates in the developing world. When confronted with data like these, I have to ask to what extent these rates reflect an additional dose of prejudice, discrimination, and internalized homophobia experienced by black men who feel marginalized by both the white gay communities that they live in and the black straight communities that they live in. One of the most perplexing things about these high rates of HIV among black men who have sex with men is that recent studies indicate that they aren't engaging in that much more high-risk behavior than their white counterparts. And yet, their rates of infection are 4 times higher. What the heck is going on here? It's complicated, no doubt. But one very sad reality today is that the prevalence of HIV within the sexual networks of black men who have sex with men is already very high. So that means that the chances are good that when a young black man meets a new partner, that guy will already be infected. and that even one instance of unprotected sex with that guy is going to carry significant risk. And who among us has not slipped up from time to time? But if you slip up in a pool where there's very little HIV infection, it's probably going to be okay. If you slip up in a pool that is filled with HIV, chances are it may not be okay. So, homophobia in all its forms, whether internalized, turned against one another, or directed at us from outside, remains the greatest challenge to the LGBT community in America today. A number of studies of gay and lesbian youth have found that they are 3 to 4 times as likely to attempt suicide as their heterosexual counterparts. The 2009 National School Climate Survey found that 85% of LGBT students report being verbally harassed, 40% report being physically harassed, and 19% report being physically assaulted at school in the past year because of their sexual orientation. And they were more than 4 times as likely to report missing school in the previous 30 days because of concerns about their safety. A 2011 Gallup poll found that 39% of Americans still think that homosexual relations are morally wrong. Now that's down from 48% in 2008, so that's progress. Opinions are changing, but meanwhile, gay kids are still being harassed and still committing suicide. So as with AIDS, the struggle against homophobia continues. And it's clear that we're in both struggles for the long haul. And both struggles require collaboration across all kinds of lines: gay and straight, black and white, adult and adolescent. So I want to conclude on a note of optimism. 3 notes of optimism, actually. The first one is the Trevor Project. And that's an organization founded a few years ago committed to ending suicide among LGBTQ youth by providing life-saving and life-affirming resources, including a 24-hour hotline. And it's equally committed to helping create a future where the possibilities, opportunities, and dreams are the same for all youth, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. My second note of optimism is It Gets Better, an online project that airs over 10,000 user-created videos developed in response to LGBT youth suicides, and developed to show young people that their lives, LGBT young people, that their lives will get easier, happier, and better if they can just get through their teen years. How many of you have been to that website? So maybe a third of you. That's great. It's an amazing website. I really encourage you to check it out sometime. These videos are made by the likes of famous people whose names you see here, plus thousands of ordinary folks. And one of the most impressive videos of all is a 15-minute video made by the LGBT Center at North Carolina State University. Watch it. It will make you proud to be a North Carolinian. It really will. It's amazing. So my third note of optimism is the promising community-based model for confronting and undermining homophobia, the gay-straight alliances that have cropped up in high schools all over America, including schools in North Carolina. How many of you come from a high school that had a GSA, a gay-straight alliance? Wow. Now that was like 3/4 of you. That's impressive. If I had asked that 4 years ago, not even 10% of the students here would have raised their hands, I don't think. So when these organizations get started, they're often opposed by school administrators who are afraid of some sort of community backlash. But the young people who were involved in these alliances from the get-go would not back down and would not be denied. To me, their work is both exciting and inspiring, in part because it's happening at the local level, where the changes ultimately have to occur, and in part because it's led by students themselves, not by parents, not by teachers, not by administrators. So I believe that young adults like yourselves and your younger brothers and sisters who are still in high school are going to lead the way in ending homophobia, just as people your age often led the way in the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the early fight against AIDS. So I'm going to end this talk by thanking you for what you've done and what you will do to end prejudice and discrimination against LGBT people. And I want you to know that in doing so, you are also fighting AIDS by creating environments where LGBT people feel that we are safe and supported and our lives are worth protecting. So thanks very much. Appreciate it.